A trial that could shake the foundation of the criminal justice system in Illinois is set to begin soon in Chicago. 7 prosecutors and police officers are accused of fabricating the evidence that sent an innocent man named Rolando Cruz to death row for the rape and murder of a 10-year-old girl. What is most disturbing about this story is that another man, a man who actually confessed to the murder, has not been prosecuted for it and may never be. For nearly 10 years, Rolando Cruz sat on death row, counting the days until his execution. But ever since Cruz and 2 other men were first arrested in 1983 for the rape and murder of Janine Nicarico in the Chicago suburb of Naperville, serious doubts were raised about their guilt. There was no physical evidence or eyewitness testimony linking any of them to the crime. Even one of the lead detectives assigned to the case, John Sam, was convinced they didn't do it.
I told my bosses on numerous occasions that I did not believe these 3 men had anything whatsoever to do with this crime, that we totally have the wrong people. We need to go out and look at someone else.
And they said to you?
No. No more.
Don't investigate?
Don't do another thing.
Why?
Because I was making the case look bad. If I was out looking at other people, that means we weren't too convinced that they were guilty, and once they were indicted, they didn't want that out.
Rolando Cruz and the 2 other men, Alex Hernandez and Stephen Buckley, became prime suspects after Cruz and Hernandez told police they had information about the murder. Information police said only the killers could know. Later, they said they really didn't know anything. They were just trying to collect the reward money offered in the case. But a jury found Cruz and Hernandez guilty and sentenced them to death. They appealed. And based on a legal technicality, the conviction was thrown out. They were tried again, convicted again, and sent back to death row. Rolando Cruz was given a date for his execution.
I knew I didn't do anything wrong. I wasn't going to just sit there and let them execute me. I was going to do everything I could do to get out.
Now enter a world-famous mystery writer who also happens to be a lawyer, Scott Turow, whose bestsellers include Presumed Innocent and Burden of Proof. Turow decided to take on a real-life murder mystery after he was convinced that, in this case, the wrong men were sent to death row. He handled the second appeal for Alex Hernandez.
Can you imagine committing a murder of this nature and leaving behind no physical evidence of any kind, not a fingerprint, not a hair, not a fiber, no DNA? Come on. Come on.
You've written several successful novels involving murder and the criminal justice system. How does the plot in this case measure up?
This is a very sad story. This is a really, really sad story.
According to Turow, it started with political pressure to make an arrest. Pressure from voters in the affluent community where the murder victim lived. And the prosecutors responded to it, Turow says, by indicting Rolando Cruz and the 2 others just 2 weeks before a hotly contested election for the job of top prosecutor in DuPage County.
That community was up in arms, and they demanded, they demanded justice.
There was pressure on the police and prosecutors to bring someone
Absolutely.
to the system, try them, convict them, put them away.
You're going to be an ineffective law enforcement person in their eyes if you don't come up with a perpetrator.
But twice, a jury looked at this case. 2 separate juries found these guys guilty.
Are you asking me why?
That's pretty compelling evidence, isn't it?
It's not compelling evidence if you don't put the case on straight.
And the case that was made against Rolando Cruz was anything but straight, especially one highly incriminating piece of evidence which was used to convict Cruz. It was a statement Cruz allegedly made about a dream he had, which police said contained details of the crime that only the murderer could have known. The problem with this so-called dream statement is that Cruz said he never made it, and nobody has a record of it ever occurring. There's no police report, no tape recording, and the first time it was ever mentioned was 1.5 years after he supposedly made it, and just 4 days before Cruz went on trial. Thomas Knight prosecuted Rolando Cruz in his first trial. Knight says the dream statement was just one part of the case against Rolando Cruz, and he had no reason to question its validity.
You decided to present incriminating evidence against Cruz based in part on this dream statement, and yet the police who heard it never wrote it down. They never made a report about it. They never recorded it. I mean, something doesn't sound right.
You know, people are not that perfect that they end up writing everything down.
They wrote everything else down?
Well, I don't think that's probably not even true.
My experience is that when the defendant confesses, the police always write that down. There's no conceivable reason that you would not make a record of an incredibly incriminating statement. Not in my experience as a lawyer.
But an even more incredibly incriminating statement was made when, soon after Rolando Cruz was sent to death row after his first trial, this man, Brian Dugan, a career criminal, told authorities that he was the one who killed Janine Nicarico. Dugan confessed to the Nicarico murder after he was arrested and confessed to 2 other murders in neighboring counties. He was sentenced to life in prison, but the new prosecutor on the case in DuPage County, Robert Colander, chose not to believe Brian Dugan killed Janine Nicarico. The Illinois State Police, believing that Dugan might be the real killer, assigned Detective Ed Sosowski to investigate.
Sitting here today, is there any doubt in your mind as to who raped and murdered Janine Nicarico?
No doubt whatsoever.
And that person is?
Brian Dugan.
What is it that brings you to that conclusion?
He knew information that no one else could know. He knew what type of tape was used to bind the blindfold around her eyes. He knew what type of sexual assault had taken place. And I'm giving you facts, sir, that were not public.
Detective Sosowski took his evidence to the prosecutors who had already sent Cruz to death row.
What did the prosecutors do with this information?
They resisted it.
So they essentially blew it off.
Yes, sir.
So if they accept your information that Brian Dugan did it, then they have to admit that the people they have put in prison didn't do it.
Put on death row. Didn't do it.
Despite Brian Dugan's confession and the lack of any physical evidence linking Rolando Cruz to the crime, Cruz was tried a second time. He was convicted again, but a higher court threw out that guilty verdict as they did the first one, because they said the jury did not get to hear all the incriminating evidence against Brian Dugan. Still, DuPage County prosecutors decided to put Cruz on trial for a third time, even though new DNA evidence had come to light linking Brian Dugan to the Nicarico murder.
Even after DNA testing proved that Brian Dugan was clearly involved in this crime, even though that was established, they went ahead and tried Rolando Cruz again. That's frightening to me.
It was in the middle of the third trial when a high-ranking police official admitted that he had lied about the evidence against Cruz that the prosecution's case collapsed. The judge immediately stopped the trial, and Rolando Cruz, after spending a decade on death row, was finally free.
It's not that easy. I mean, people tell me, well, you're free now. Free? How? Psychologically, I'm not free from it all.
A year after the conviction of Rolando Cruz was finally thrown out, the legal system was turned upside down when a special grand jury took the unprecedented step of indicting the very people who had built the case against Cruz. 3 prosecutors and 4 police officers were charged with fabricating the case, making up the evidence that had sent Cruz to death row and kept him there for 10 years. According to the indictment, a critical line had been crossed, the line between aggressive prosecution and criminal misconduct. Prosecutor Thomas Knight was arrested and charged with knowing that Cruz's dream statement was fabricated, but presenting it to the jury anyway. And prosecutor Robert Colander was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice for concealing the details of Brian Dugan's confession, which could have freed Cruz from death row years earlier.
I think the main charge should be conspiracy to commit murder, because that's what they did. They conspired when they made that up to commit a murder, to have me executed for something I didn't do.
What troubles many people about this case is that even before Brian Dugan confessed to the Nicarico murder, there was evidence that could have led police to Dugan before he went on to rape and murder two other people, an 8-year-old girl named Melissa Ackerman and 27-year-old nurse Donna Schnorr. Immediately after the Janine Nicarico murder, two eyewitnesses told police they saw a fair-skinned man between the ages of 25 and 30 driving away from the murder scene in an old green car with a missing hubcap. That description fit Brian Dugan and the car that he owned. But prosecutors became totally convinced that Rolando Cruz was the killer and dropped that promising lead. Thomas Breen is Rolando Cruz's lawyer.
How would you describe the quality of the police work in the Nicarico case?
Real policemen follow real leads, and they inventory real evidence. They do real investigations. This was a joke.